Kia ora Aotearoa. Good evening and welcome to the Union Report, where we review the news week through the lens of industrial disputes with union leaders, commentators and politicians. Joining me tonight to discuss events is author, blogger and political commentator Chris Trotter and the National Secretary for the Public Service Association, Brenda Pilot. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, issue 1, what is really behind the 130 job losses for the super ministry, and with a zero budget, how much more cutbacks can the public sector take? Issue 2, what do the latest revelations from the manufactured crisis at the Hobbit tell us about this government's negotiating style with unions? Issue 3, what does May Day mean to the union movement now? How do unions find relevance in a consumer culture? And we'll wrap the show with a final thought and preview upcoming events. But let's start tonight with issue 1. On top of the thousands of public service jobs already slashed, the super ministry merger looks to add another 130 job losses. What real cost will merging 4 departments into one create? Brenda, these are your members facing yet another round of cuts. Has redundancy fatigue set in yet?
Oh, it set in some time ago. We've lost 2,500 jobs just out of the public service alone. If you take the wider state sector, about 5,500 jobs. Restructuring fatigue is well and truly set in, and change management cuts and redundancies, they're really eating away at the morale in the public service.
So where are these massive productivity gains supposed to come from if the staff themselves are too fatigued to actually implement the change?
Well, it's a good question, and it's not that people aren't working long hours, they are. We've got a fewer number of people doing the same or more work, so it's not that people aren't working hard enough. The government has, I think, in you talking the second item about creating a crisis, I think the government created a crisis to give itself the rationale to do what it wanted to do, which was to cut the public service. It's in the National Party's DNA. They like small government, they like to cut the public service, and they do that every time they're in government. They did it in the 1990s and they're doing it again now.
What's wrong with small government?
I think it's not a matter of large government or small government. It's about saying what are the functions we want our government to do, what are the functions we want the public service to do. And we've never really had that debate. So we get this seesawing. Labor comes in and they rebuild the public service. They did that a bit, not as much as we wanted, but they did rebuild, and now we're doing the opposite. And of course, John Key fronted up at our PSA conference in 2008, a couple of months before the election, stood in front of our delegates and said, we're not going to cut the public service, we're just going to cap it at this level, and we don't really think restructuring achieves much, so we're not going to do too much of that. So there were two things that I'm reluctant to use the word lies, but they've certainly not been, those are certainly promises that haven't been met.
Why should the public care about job losses in the public sector? So many people are frightened about keeping their jobs right now. There is a mentality that's now driven, you're lucky if you've got a job.
Well, certainly unemployment is growing, and I think it's very easy to look at another sector and say, well, that's just those people.
That's very easy.
It's very easy, and I guess if you work in somewhere, a bit unpopular, like Inland Revenue, you're in charge of collecting fines. People don't love those jobs, but we need our public services. We need a good public service. We need people who do those jobs, unpopular as they may be. And let's face it, those 2,500 jobs that have gone were peopled before by, folk in the community, just like any of us. We shouldn't want to see fellow New Zealanders lose their jobs.
Chris, the Prime Minister says he wants business-facing departments. How does one make science and innovation, economic development, labour and housing business-facing when these departments each have much wider social mandates?
Well, I think this government has a degree of hostility towards the idea of social mandates from the word go. I see the National Party now regarding the public service and government in general as something to be reduced to the absolute minimum, something which only handles those things which must be done, and anything which the state in the past has been associated with, which this government believes the private sector could do as well, if not better, it wants to strip out of the public service. And I suspect that in some quarters of the National Party, that would extend even into education, health and welfare. I mean, across the whole of the Western world now, from the right in particular, there is this view that the state really has had its chance to demonstrate that it can do these jobs effectively. The right argues that it hasn't performed to expectations, and that now it must be put in the hands of the private sector. It's important to note, however, that the funding is not being left to the private sector.
No, no, no.
They are still quite happy to take people's taxes, but rather than give them to a state institution, they are now going to give them to private institutions. This is what the whole charter schools initiative is headed towards. But a business-facing ministry is just what it says, and what you would expect from a minister like Stephen Joyce. He sees the government's role as facilitating investment, facilitating the conduct of business, removing all obstacles to the conduct of business, and providing as much assistance as is, well, legal, one would have to say these days. And if it's not legal, well, we can make it so.
For the right price.
Yes, providing you're willing to cough up the necessaries. But, you know, this is a mindset which is now in place, firmly in place, I think, not only in National, of course, but in the ACT Party most vociferously. And, you know, the Public Service Association, you know, has got a huge fight on its hands.
Yeah.
I mean, throughout the 90s, and certainly during the period of Labour rule in the first decade of this century, the PSA really led the way in trying to establish a partnership between themselves, their members, and the various CEOs of the various government departments and ministries, but also more broadly with the government. Now, you know, I'd be interested to hear how Brenda thought that went under Helen Clark. I suspect, you know, there were ups and there were downs, pluses and minuses, but that approach is just gone.
That's gone. So there's no sit down and negotiation. It's we're going to do it this way. The public service, Brenda, has seen thousands of job losses, and the government will claim that the economic recession leaves them no options. How does austerity and a public service coexist?
Well, you know, I'm a refugee from Thatcher's Britain. I came here in 1980, and I, you know, well remember that there is no alternative line, and I've been sceptical about it ever since, and I am to this day. The government's general line is that, you know, that the government's in a lot of trouble financially, and there's no option but to cut public funding. The problem about the debt, however, is that it's about private debt. It's not about public debt. No. By international standards, most countries would kill for our books, actually, and there's no sort of justification from that. It is all about ideology. And if I can just pick up a point that that Chris made, you're quite right that during the first decade of the century, we did work with the Clark government on, you know, in a partnership way. We look back on that and think, yeah, we could have been, you know, we'd like to have seen some more tangible outcomes. But the basic problem was that there was no fundamental change in the way the Labour government of that time was thinking about it. There was no real challenge, in my view, to the neoliberal agenda, and we've still got that, and that is still that's still the challenge. And until we push back some of those sort of fundamental ideas, we're basically just tinkering around the edges.
Chris, each of these departments would provide differing advice to a minister on any given issue. By merging them, the impact will be the minister receiving less critical advice. Who wins and who loses in that?
Well, there are still a whole host of statutory obligations which some of these merged institutions are required to carry out. It seems a very cumbersome, a very top-heavy bureaucratic structure that they're trying to build. And I'm not entirely sure why they are doing it, because as you quite rightly point out, the component parts of MOBI, as it's called, begging for someone to talk about Dick, but never mind. is, you know, that it's going to be business focused. But I mean, where does the Labour Department fit in with that? The Labour Department is supposed to primarily look after the interests of employees. And to make sure that employers live up to their obligations. Now,
Peter Conway says that it should be worker-facing, not business-facing.
well, I mean, but you see, so much has been dismantled. I mean, the Labour Department once worked hand in gloves with an extremely powerful trade union movement and a very tightly organised employers grouping. That is largely gone. I mean, the old awards system is gone. All of that work is now sort of moot. The only thing that the Labour Department really should have maintained to the same level as, you know, in the pre-neoliberal era was, of course, its safety inspectorate. But as Pike River has demonstrated, even that was allowed to deteriorate.
Fall by the side.
And I mean, the chances of the Labour Department doing anything like the work you would expect it to do now, I think, is pretty slim.
Sure. Final question, very quickly. How will the government zero budget impact further on public services? Where are you seeing this further down the line?
Well, we're about to see $1 billion more cut out of the public service. That was announced at the last budget, right across the public service. They're talking about $800 million worth of new spending that's now not going to happen, which means they're going to need to claw back some more funding. We're expecting
but surely
to see
services must be compromised at that point, surely.
They're already starting to be compromised. We're already starting to see offices being closed and you get an 0800 number to call. So we're seeing that happening right across provincial jobs and provincial services, and that will be more so. You can't take $1 billion out of the public service without seeing
And you've
some
also got
cuts.
to, I think, understand the social effects of this kind of austerity program. Civil servants, public servants, not only have a role to play in terms of the administration of the country, but they have a role to play in the community as well.
The economy, right? Yeah.
I mean, these were people who traditionally had secure jobs, reasonably well paid jobs. They were reasonably and sometimes highly educated people. So they provided a kind of ballast in a community. They were people of means, people of education, people that could command respect. And you take these out of a community, and the community is weaker.
Right.
I mean, it's not just the nurses and the teachers who are the most visible face of the state, but it's all those other people. I used to get invited, for example, this isn't the state sector, this is local government, to speak to an organisation of local government officers, and you know, I got to know them quite well over the years, and you realise that these are the sort of unsung heroes of society, the ones that keep things going, the ones that just make it all look so effortless, you know, like the swan gliding while underneath it's paddling furiously away. Well, those are the paddlers, and you take them out, and things change, and they don't change for the better.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2. So it turns out with revelations this week that the Actors Union weren't the threat to the Hobbit that the government and Peter Jackson claimed at the time. What does such tactics suggest about labour relations in this country? Chris, you were one of the first bloggers to criticise this Hobbit fiasco. What do these week's revelations alongside Peter Jackson's emails show us? Was this a manufacturing crisis from day one?
Well, I think both you and I and Gordon Campbell and quite a number of others who were blogging, and the blogs do allow you to respond very quickly. I think I was 8 minutes behind you. but leaving aside the blogosphere, I mean, the whole media event was, quite frankly, a work of art. And I think Peter Jackson, an award-winning, an Oscar-winning director, showed just how skillful he is. Ably assisted by his offsider at Weta Workshops, Richard Taylor. I mean, there was clearly a script here, and there were actors, and Sir Peter was one of them, and Richard Taylor was another, and Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyens were others. And then, of course, you had Chris Finlayson, who just happens to be our Attorney General, releasing supposed, legal advice saying that it's illegal for these people to try and take any kind of industrial action. I mean, much of that legal advice is still being withheld. You know, OIA requests, appeals to the Ombudsman have not resulted in the release of that sort of information.
Except to Warner Brothers and Peter
Well,
Jackson,
yes,
apparently.
and that is, you know, the real ethical disaster in this whole incident. That so many people were willing to go along with the script.
Brenda, Warner Brothers has a long history of attacking unions, all the way back to the Un-American Committee blacklisting of supposed communists like John Howard Lawson, who founded the Screen Actors Guild. Should corporates with long-standing union grudges be able to inspire legislative change around labour law minus any select committee process?
Well, I think corporates, whether they've got a good relationship or a bad relationship with unions, shouldn't be having the kind of influence they have on the government. It was clear during the course of this dispute, and the papers that have been released subsequently bear that out, that they had extraordinary access to the business of cabinet. They had extraordinary access to ministers, acting like, you know, teenage groupies, you know, with One Direction. I've never, you know, extraordinary kind of behaviour on the part of our rather starstruck ministers. And the worst thing, actually, from my point of view, that came out most recently was the extent to which they were also prepared to distort the immigration laws. Now, if you're a public servant and you did that, you'd be down the road. You'd lose your job. So here's a real example of a double standard.
Chris, the timing of this manufacturing crisis was very deliberate and political, wasn't it? The 20,000 union members who had marched 24 hours earlier against Key's harsh new labour laws had all media attention sucked away from them once Weta Workshop started protesting. How did the mainstream media get so played?
Well, I'm reluctant to opt for conspiracy, but you know, one of the things that I think was immediately you know, apparent to me was that not only had you the rights at work rallies around the country. There was a huge one here at Telstra Stadium. But just days before that, you had a very powerful Labour Party conference. I think you were there, where Phil Goff, you know, gave you know, the speech of his life, really. And it did seem to me extraordinarily fortuitous for the government that the whole impetus of that shift to the left in the Labour Party and the sort of answering response, mass response from the trade union movement was just brought to a shuddering halt.
Amazing, wasn't it?
Now, you know, the difference in coverage of a rally at Telstra Stadium down in South Auckland with over 8,000 workers present and a pre-planned, top-down directed march of employees through Wellington over something which was done and dusted, which is what the information that's been released shows quite clearly. I mean, the difference in coverage was quite remarkable. The way, for example, the sort of ambush of the Australian chap and Robin Malcolm.
That's right, and Wellington.
And Frances, I think she's called Frances Walsh as well.
That's right.
To confuse things. I mean, the way that they were sort of pounced upon by people as they left the Matterhorn restaurant in Wellington. And of course, these were people who knew what they were doing with cameras. And the way that was able to make its way onto YouTube and to make its way into the mainstream media. I mean, you know, this really was superbly orchestrated, and at no point do I recall any of the mainstream media saying to itself, wait a minute, are we being played? Are we being drawn into something that someone else has written and is directing? But they didn't. I mean, the most egregious example was the interview that Paul Holmes supposedly conducted with Helen Kelly, where you know, it was a full-scale, no holds barred attack on her as a person, on her credibility.
Yep.
You know, it really was. It was ugly. I haven't seen anything the like of it, you know, for a very, very long time.
Brenda, Robin Malcolm was described by an industry boss as damaged goods for her stand, and Helen Kelly received death threats. Article 23 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states it's a fundamental human right for people to form trade unions and collectively bargain. This denigration was anti-union hysteria, wasn't it? How can you negotiate with a government prepared to use those types of tactics?
Well, it's very difficult, and of course, you know, in the PSA we're dealing with the government all the time. And while that is at the extreme end, I think both of those women deserve an apology. I think it's very clear that they were right, they were just, they told the truth, and they had a good point. They deserve an apology from the government, and I hope they get it.
Final question on this issue. Do you think the executives from Warner Brothers, as they flew back home in their corporate jet, referred to New Zealand as a shire folk? Do you think they did? Did they call us hobbits and have a bit of a laugh at the money they made out of us?
They were certainly willing to take advantage of what was on offer. But, I mean, I think in fairness to Warner Brothers, they had pretty much arrived at an agreement, from what I can gather reading, particularly Helen Kelly's very in-depth description of the whole affair. I think the person driving it from the very beginning was Peter Jackson.
Yeah. Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3. Tomorrow is May Day, the International Workers' Day, the traditional annual celebration of the global unionised movement. Brenda, what does May Day mean for the union movement in the 21st century?
In New Zealand, I'd be inclined to say not a great deal.
Yep.
You know, I mean, obviously Labour Day and the celebration of the introduction of the 8-hour working day, while that's beginning to look like a grim and a long and romantic memory, is actually really more our day, isn't it? I don't know about you, but when I think of May Day, I think of, you know, something rather Soviet and goose-stepping, people dragging large missiles through Red Square. May Day, however, you know, like a lot of those other days, International Workers' Day, International Working Women's Day, do provide us with an opportunity to sort of reflect on the values of the union movement and reflect on the past. For myself, prefer that we look forward and we think about where we want to be in 100 years' time, not necessarily so much where we've come from.
Sure. Chris, is the irony of an International Workers' Day the reality that free market globalisation pits unions against each other for a race to the bottom? When will a political counter to the free market orthodoxy arrive for workers?
Well, that's a very big question, Martin. It was very much the creation of an internationalist mood, May Day. And it has its origins, although I quite readily concede the Soviet celebration of May Day certainly sticks in one's mind. But it was originally an American invention, and it was about the huge campaign for an 8-hour day. It was bound up with the Haymarket so-called riot. And what really distinguishes that period, which is sort of late 19th century, early 20th century, from our own, you know, it's almost exactly 100 years ago, is that there's far less of that internationalism today. The idea that you know, all the workers of the world should unite was very strong at the turn of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. It was a period of enormous hopefulness on the part of organised labour and their political parties around the world. Because it looked as though the world was progressing. I mean, the idea of progress was never stronger. And it looked as though the world was progressing towards a time when there would be less need for the sort of arduous toil that characterised most people's working lives, when science and technology would free people from drudgery, where education would free people from ignorance and superstition, and that the world was moving towards this bright future.
We don't see that now?
Well, no, because one terrible event stopped that in its tracks, and that was World War I. It gave us the Soviet Union, it gave us the Communist Revolution in Russia, but it also gave us Nazism, it gave us Stalinism. That wonderful period of hope and confidence in the future was shattered by World War I, which turned the idea of progress on its head. Here were the supposedly civilized states of the earth, the ones who are leading the way, slaughtering their own citizens by the million. As no doubt the leader of the Russian Revolution, Lenin, would have pointed out, instead of all those social democratic parties voting down the call for expenditure on armaments, they voted for them.
That's right,
because in the end, nationalism trumps socialism, and that I think explains to a large extent why, in this country in particular, May Day never really took hold, and because it was associated with the Soviets, it was always a bit off to one side.
Thank you for that, panel. Let's wrap the show with a final word. Brenda, your final word this weekend.
Two final words, if I may.
Yep.
Firstly, Helen Kelly does deserve an apology, and she should get one.
Amen.
Secondly, my last word is to the political parties on the left. Really, really important issues facing workers in this country. We need a clear and well thought through alternative, and we need our political parties to be presenting that coherently. It's 2 years till the next election. The prospect of a third-term national government as the head of the PSA fills me with a lot of discomfort. I would like to think that we'll have a good election campaign. For that to happen, the left parties have got to get their act together. Chris, your final word this week is?
Well, along with you, Martin, I marched up Queen Street on Saturday afternoon, and as always, large groups of people gathered together for a common purpose is an exhilarating experience. But I couldn't help thinking back to, as recently as the 1980s, campaign efforts like the one for the elimination of the wage freeze, or back into the 70s, the response to the arrest of Bill Anderson when Queen Street was filled with workers who pretty much put themselves there, whether their union officials told them to or not, and just the extraordinary difference that the National Party's deliberate destruction of the New Zealand trade union movement has made to the ability of New Zealanders to fight things like asset sales.
Thank you, Brenda. Thank you, Chris. Coming up, events-wise, stop the cuts to Newton Union Health Services, 5:30 p.m. Thursday at St Anne's School Hall, Newton and Wellington. And Saturday night sees the May Day Concert 2012 at Regent on Broadway, Palmerston North, a mighty night of solidarity with music, dance, song and performance art. Judges for May Day Cup will be Peter Conway and Ian Lees Galloway. If I don't get an invite, all expenses invited, they'll be very disappointed. Check out our Facebook site for full event details and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter account for all the latest show updates. Thank you for watching Aotearoa. Join us again 8 p.m. next Monday for the Union Report here on Triangle TV, the home of original public broadcasting. Good night, New Zealand.